Hi there, welcome to our ADHD Care podcast with your host, Archie. I have a very special guest with me today. I've got Zoe Marsden. Zoe is Assistant Head of Inclusion and I need to grab my notes actually.
Wellbeing, inclusion and wellbeing.
Inclusion and wellbeing, and also an SENCo or a SENCo. We used to call them SENCos in the old days, and also head of learning at one of the private schools in Surrey. Welcome, Zoe.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
And really honoured to have you joining us on our podcast today. So as you can gather, obviously, because Zoe is coming from education, we started off this theme about education a few weeks ago when we had another special guest, Fintan O'Regan. So if you want to listen back to that podcast, you can listen it back via our Spotify page. So that's the continuation discussion we're having today. So if anything, we can just kickstart this discussion with start off with just maybe telling our listeners just about your journey to get to where you are now. Particularly, I'm more interested in finding out from you in terms of like what intrigued you to kind of work in the field of SEND with our young people.
So I would imagine my route in has been similar to a lot of people in that I got dragged in as a parent, which triggered my interest, and I then pursued it through the educational field. So I used to be a criminal law solicitor. I spent many years practicing as a criminal law solicitor, and then I knew I wanted to get into education. My parents had been in education, and I'd grown up thinking that it was the last thing I wanted to do. But as I got older, I got more and more interested in it and trained to be a teacher, had my first child. And as she was growing up, so she's the first of four, as she was growing up, I began to kind of realise that there was something slightly kind of different perhaps to the others, and so as a parent I began to explore it a bit more, and then took my teaching off in that direction. I think a lot of particularly ladies in SEND have come into it like that. So something at home triggers your interest in it, and you then get sucked into the kind of the educational field, and that's exactly what happened to me. So my daughter is ASC and ADHD, and I have a son who is also ADHD. So I had that kind of natural interest at home, and then I started to specialise in it at school as well.
And how long ago are we talking about since you went into this?
Okay, so I trained as a teacher back in 1999, and I had my daughter in 2001, and then I kind of carried on doing some law for a while, but I've been SENCo in 3 schools now, I think, and I've been doing that for a good number of years now.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of how we met actually at one of the other schools you worked at, and when I was starting out in the private field, and that's quite intriguing, having come from the background you come from, working in law to then doing that transition. How did you find that transition for you? Because obviously that's completely 2 worlds apart, isn't it?
Well, kind of yes and no. So I started to do more and more youth work when I was a criminal law solicitor, and was going to young offenders institutions and things like that. And well, you know, the statistics are that a lot of the young people in the criminal justice system have got learning differences of some sort that probably haven't been picked up. And I do remember kind of being in the youth court time and time again and just kind of thinking, oh my goodness, you know, this is really desperate for these kids. And I suppose I wanted to kind of get in slightly earlier before it had got to the point where people were in the criminal justice system. And I think probably, if I'm honest with you, I was aware of the kind of the differences that some of those kids had at that point. So then when I trained to be a teacher, and I as a mum, I became a mum of children with special needs, the whole kind of thing started to make sense to me. You know, that previous experience with the youths in the criminal justice system, my own experience at home, and being a teacher in school, it all then just kind of came together to take me off down that specialist route of SEND.
Wow. And I come from, well, not criminal law as such, but I've worked with young people, youth offending, and worked worked in child and adolescent mental health services camps. So we used to have a lot of young people coming through the door, some who had some sort of what we call forensic background, where involved with the police, and we were trying to do lots of work around, crime prevention, trying to steer them in different directions and things. So
and a lot of these kids will have dropped out of education or have disengaged in education because it's been really hard work for them, because they often have got an undiagnosed need, so they won't even know that they've got a particular need going on, perhaps, but they've disengaged with education because their needs haven't been met in the class, or it's felt too difficult, and so they get taken off down a route that no one would want them to go down. And in the future, when I don't have to pay my mortgage and things, I'd like to think that I could somehow marry that back up again, that kind of the criminal justice side of things, and now my specialist knowledge with SEND.
I was talking to Finton last time, and we were talking about these young people that we're describing, and we were talking about emotional and behavioural difficulties at school, and I think that they've renamed, they've been called something else, but I think it's what we find is, as you said, that they are, I don't want to sort of say the education system is failing them, but in some situations whereby you can see that they have underlying needs that haven't been picked up, which then takes them to a certain direction or path, which unfortunately in some cases results in them going down the criminal route or antisocial behaviour.
And it's really difficult, isn't it, for all of those needs to be picked up. So, I mean, I'm privileged. I'm in an independent school, and we typically have small classes of perhaps 14 to 20. But, if you're in an independent, a state school, and you're in a class of 30, the ones that draw most attention to themselves might be... staff might begin to kind of talk about learning differences with them, but some of them will fly under the radar because they kind of blend into the background. But even the ones that the staff are aware of, unless your needs are serious enough for an EHCP and to involve the local authority in funding, actually going down that route of getting a diagnosis is pricey, isn't it? So that will prevent plenty of families from being able to fully conclude what's going on with their children, and depending on where your school is and the demographic, of course, that makes a difference as well. We're lucky in Surrey, and particularly in an independent school, that parents tend to have the money and the inclination to kind of get to the bottom of what's going on for their children. But loads of parents are, I'm sure, in the position where they'd love to be able to explore things further, but financially, it's hard, because you have to be really have quite severe needs to be able to get local authority funding through the EHCP to explore things.
And I'm glad that you brought up the question about EHCP, the point about education and healthcare plans, EHCP. We were discussing off mic earlier, and I was more intrigued just to find out from you, because I get lots of requests from parents, particularly once the young person has received a diagnosis of ADHD or autism spectrum condition. Some of them would assume that would entitle the young person automatically to getting an EHCP, which I'm aware that that's not usually the case. So maybe if you could just outline to us in terms of how the EHCP process works. Obviously, I know there's differences between private and state schools. So maybe if you could outline. So if I kind of
do it from my point of view.
From your point of view,
So I've been SENCo in 3 independent schools, and the route tends to be that either a parent will feel that they want to pursue an EHCP, or we as a body of staff might conclude that the needs are serious enough that we're talking to parents about an EHCP. But it tends in the private sector, in my experience, to be led more by the parent than by the school, because we're an independent school. We say to the parent, yes, we will support you in your application for an EHCP, but often it's the parent that's pulling all the paperwork together and making the application, and the local authority contact us for our feedback, which we provide. So to go back to your original point of, once you've got your diagnosis, does that mean you get an EHCP? Well, really sadly, no, because local authorities have got a limited budget, and they have to kind of give their budget to those in greatest need. So your needs are going to have to be quite serious before the local authority will assess you. And just because you've got an ADHD assessment or a dyslexia assessment or an ASC or autistic spectrum condition assessment doesn't open that door for you. And for any parents, I would kind of take guidance from your school and from your SENCo, because they'll have a fairly good feel for whether your particular son or daughter has needs that are serious enough to trigger the local authority intervention to start that process of it. So the local authority they do a screening process first. So they kind of you have to fill in paperwork to see if they're even interested in putting specialists in place to do assessments for an EHCP. So it's quite a kind of rigorous process, and your needs do have to be quite kind of severe before you can kind of cross that threshold.
And if you could just give us an example of what you mean severe, like if you have a case in mind, obviously without naming the young person, but what sort of needs are we talking about to justify that would more likely to get an EHCP in that case?
So if you've got kind of complex needs, so if you've got co-occurring needs, so that's quite common in SEND, isn't it, where you don't just have one condition, you might have 2 or 3 conditions overlapping with each other. So you might have autism, ADHD, dyslexia. So if it's a kind of a complex set of needs, or if the child is interventions have been put in place, they're really failing to flourish, and they're falling further and further behind their peer group, and maybe they only have one particular need, but the school isn't managing to address that within the normal differentiation that they would do, then you might trigger an EHCP application. So a couple of examples. I'm an independent assessor, and I assess for dyslexia and dyslexia-related difficulties. And I was doing a conference call the other day with a mum about this, and her son, he may have co-occurring differences, we don't know at the moment, but he looks to have a fairly severe dyslexic profile, and so quite a few of his scores were coming back in the first percentile, for example. So out of a room of 100 people, he might be in that first percentile of that whole room. That's quite severe needs for a mainstream classroom to try and meet without additional input and additional funding. I then I've got an individual who's currently applying for an EHCP at the moment, who's got overlapping needs. So some speech and language difficulties, some dyslexic difficulties, possibly some ADHD difficulties, and all of those needs are making it really difficult for that particular person to progress at the rate of their peers. And we're wondering whether they can even access the GCSE curriculum. At that point, you're kind of going, okay, mainstream class is potentially going to fail that pupil, because they're not going to achieve their potential, because teachers can only differentiate up to a certain point, can't they? And so, maybe you're looking for both of those examples. Maybe you're looking at a specialist school for them. But EHCPs, you can also have plenty of people have EHCPs within mainstream school, and it just gives them additional funding for additional input. So you can have support within the classroom, or you can have some withdrawn support to try and keep that child keeping up with their peers, so they're able to access the curriculum within that classroom environment.
Right, okay. In the old days, I remember where we used to have like school action plus and things like that. But now, obviously, those terms have kind of disappeared, and now we have IEPs and ILPs. And things.
And of course, in the private system, it's different. We don't need to follow the state system kind of labels for things, but we have what we call pupil profiles. So we have something that summarises the pupil's strengths and weaknesses. I'm really keen for pupils, parents, teachers to know the pupil's strengths and their weaknesses. I think we can often hone in a lot on the weaknesses, but if you understand what they're really good at, you've got to catch them being good as well. You've got to kind of promote those things so that you maintain their self-esteem and things. So we have pupil profiles that list strengths, weaknesses, and then have a whole host of teaching strategies for the class teacher. They have strategies on them for parents to do at home, because it's a triangulated approach. It's got to be home, parent, pupil all kind of working, home, school, pupil all working together to try and bridge any gaps. So we've got kind of strategies that parents can do at home, and then we've got things that pupils should be doing to try and make their lives a bit easier.
Yeah, very interesting. The other thing I wanted to bring up was just about choosing the right school for your child, be it for primary or for secondary. And again, this is something that I get asked quite a lot, and what to recommend. And usually, I always say to parents, obviously, visit the school, do your research, speak to other parents. If there's any support groups online that you can find out that will be discussing about these things, to see if you can and link and connect with others. What would you say? Well, what advice would you give to a parent who's considering or exploring options?
All of that.
Yeah.
So find out if you know any parents in the school, or you've got friends of friends who know people, because that first-hand account that is straight from the horse's mouth is really valuable. But I would, from a SENCo point of view, if I'm looking at it as at paperwork that comes into me, if I can see that parents are on board and embracing any differences, then that's a real bonus for me. If I can see that references are coming through from schools, and it looks as if there are potentially additional needs, but maybe parents are resistant about that, that can be a bit more problematic to work with, because you all need to be working as a team. As I said just now, parents need to be on board, pupil needs to understand who they are, and school needs to understand how to support them. So I'm really keen on parents kind of embracing their children's needs, and being prepared to be open-minded and work with school about it. I'm a parent, so from a parent point of view, I'd visit schools, go with your gut feeling as well. Walk around that environment and see what it feels like. Try and talk to the SENCo if you're in that kind of field of knowing that you're needing special needs input. Then definitely try and make contact with the SENCo and see what kind of provision that the school can put in place, and just go with your gut feeling, really.
Is there anything published online that parents can look at about that particular school? And obviously school, they have information that they put on their website about how SEN inclusive they are, and what they have in place to support students that have additional SEND needs. But I don't know, it's there. I'm not sure if there is. I know you can look at Ofsted reports, but for private schools, that's different.
You can still look at Ofsted. You can still look at reports. They're called ISI inspections, independent school inspections, and they are available in the same way as Ofsted reports are available. So definitely do your homework like that. So look and see how that school's been rated. All those inspections will refer to the meeting of special needs within that environment. So I'd be reading through the longer reports. The short reports might not go into the same detail, but I'll be looking for the latest long report on the school and see how those needs are being met, and what the inspectors are saying about needs being met in the classroom. First and foremost, those needs need to be met in the classroom. We do withdrawn support, and that's great, because you can then meet the needs of those pupils on a one-to-one basis, or you can meet the needs of those pupils in a small group. But the majority of their time is spent in the class, and you need to know that the teachers and the school are embracing kind of strategies that are going to make it easier for those pupils with ADHD or ASC or dyslexia or whatever.
Joe, I'm just going to adjust your microphone.
Okay.
So I can see that it's hiding your face.
Okay.
Right, there you go. See
Better?
Yeah,
cool.
they can see you now. So
so you were asking me about how you'd kind of filter out which schools you might go for. Do a walk around, talk to as many people as you can. In particular, try and talk to the SENCo. There's nothing stopping you asking if you can talk to a couple of the pupils and getting some kind of pupil feedback. Sometimes schools send you off on a tour with pupils, and they can be quite good. That's what we do. They can be quite good because you can really kind of talk to those pupils as you're walking around about their perception of how school life is and how inclusive it is. And it's in schools as well. I quite like the whole idea of them have like peer support or peer-to-peer support or mentor. Which is similar to what you just touched on there, where it's a young person
them either giving them a tour around the school and stuff. And that actually happened with my son when we went to visit his school. And I think you could see the difference as much as the teacher and the head teachers were showing us around the things. Was if you have a young person, they can give you their own different take to it. And
definitely, yeah. And talking of peer support, then. Some schools are ours, and the other schools that I've worked at have kind of peer-to-peer mentoring systems, so that if you are finding something particularly difficult, they might match you up with an older role model, mentor, someone who might have found the same kind of difficulties as you're finding, that you can kind of chat to, because your chat as a pupil with a fellow pupil is going to be a bit different to your chat that you might have with a member of staff. So you're looking at, what support systems has the school got in place? What's the SENCo saying? Do they have kind of withdrawn support? Do they have any in-class support? Do they do group work? How au fait are the teachers with SEN within the classroom? Do they have a kind of peer-to-peer mentoring system so that your son or daughter can go and get support from other pupils? So you're looking at that whole kind of almost that pastoral wellbeing. Of the whole system.
I know if I compare secondary and primary schools, a lot that I often hear is one secondary school is a big school, lots of classrooms, lots of lessons, lots of moving around, and in some cases, particularly with some children that we see with SEND, ADHD, autism, or learning difficulties, that one is quite overwhelming in itself, just transitioning from that primary to secondary. And two, you tend to get teachers who have, they respond differently to these young people as well. So you might find one that seems to understand the young person, seems to get them, willing to be on board and support them. And then you might get one who, so you tend to get the differentiations, which can then obviously affect the young person in terms of how they perform, how they're more likely to engage in that particular subject I suppose you could say that with anyone else without SEND needs, but that's something that we noticed that transition is quite a challenging transition within itself. So from secondary school perspective, in terms of how do you make sure that there's that consistency as much as you can across
with a transition from a primary to a secondary, or within a secondary school from teacher to teacher and things like that?
A bit of both, yeah.
Yeah, so primary to secondary, in an ideal world, as a SENCo, you would have the time and the links to then go to the feeder school and observe the pupil in the primary school, and get to know them a bit, so that you are a kind of friendly face for them when they come to your school, and so that you've kind of seen the working systems that are going on in the primary school, and you can perhaps try and reproduce them to an extent as they transition up to senior school. A lot of SENCos don't have time for that, but if you do, that's great, because you've then already forged those links and you're making the child feel a bit more secure. You'd probably be looking at doing that in an ideal world. Obviously, you'd be looking at doing that for all pupils, not just SEND, but all of them, so that they've got a friendly face or faces that they know for when they come to the new school. And a lot of schools do kind of transition days where they call the kids in for a day when they're just on their own. It's just that year group in school, so it might be right at the end of a term when all the other children have gone home, and you're just calling in your prospective year sevens so that they are not overwhelmed with all the other pupils and are getting to know each other, which is great. And then to track back to that kind of particular SEND child, if you can go and meet them in school, absolutely fantastic. But if you can't do that, then you need kind of robust systems in place for when they transition up to you. So you need as much information as the feeder school can give you about, what have they put in place, what's succeeded, what's not succeeded, been successful, and to then be really kind of on it with your pupil profiles. So those have kind of gone out before the beginning of term, and the teachers know the profiles of those pupils that they're looking out for, and know what strategies they're trying to implement in the classroom. So, for someone who's ASC, who's going to find those transitions really difficult, what's the school put in place? Have they put a kind of a buddy system in place so that ASC pupil is being taken around by another pupil, and they're not left on their own at that point of transitioning, because most secondary schools you're going to transition between subjects, you're going to move from classroom to classroom, whereas a lot of primary schools you're with one class teacher, aren't you? You're with your year 6 class teacher and you're with them all day, or you might be with them most of the day apart from English and maths. And so you have to look at the strategies that are going to suit the individual child, but you need to make sure that the anxiety is reduced as much as possible, so that they have as much chance of success as possible. So you are doing things like buddying them up. You'd buddy up your ADHD pupil, because they might kind of get a bit distracted and lose where the rest of the class are going. So what strategies are you putting in place for those times in between lessons where you're moving between them, and then what strategies are you putting in place in the classroom so that they feel at ease as quickly as possible? So and that comes back to those teaching strategies on the pupil profile. And going back to your other point of everybody responds differently to different people, don't they? I mean, you can't get on with everyone in the world, whether you're SND or not. You're going to immediately connect with some people and not connect with others so much, and that's going to happen in the classroom. You're going to have teachers as an SEND pupil who you really connect with because they get you and they've got their strategy sorted, and you're going to have others that don't quite hit the spot for you. And that is life. But every teacher should be trying to meet the needs of SEND children within their classroom. You are naturally going to connect with some more than others, but everybody does have that duty to try and meet those needs.
And as a school, just in terms of training around SEND, in your role, sort of heading that sort of department, do you offer ongoing training updates to teachers at all about all things SEND?
Yeah, so going back to that concept of transitioning, we had in one of my schools, we had a very autistic boy joining, and we'd been to school to see how he was getting on in school, what strategies were working, but part of our inset day at the beginning of September was whole school training about what his needs were, how he was going to present, what you might see if he was getting overwhelmed, and how you might deal with that. So that kind of that holistic approach to him. So not just, how are you going to meet his needs educationally, but how are you going to meet his needs as he comes into this school and as he moves around. And that was a whole staff inset because his needs were so particular that actually we needed to do that. Right. But normally at the beginning of an academic year, you'll have an aspect of SEND training for staff, and often you'll be doing a quick summary of the new pupils that are joining, maybe a refresher of some of the more complex pupils that are coming back into the following the next academic year, just to remind staff who they are and what they should be doing, and that kind of generic SEN training kind of should go on throughout the year. So you should be given some inset slots quite regularly as a SENCo so that you can keep staff up to date with things. And we have things like teaching and learning workshops, which are run after school, and I get offered a regular slot on them, and people can sign up and come to them, so that we are approaching particular needs. In one of the schools I worked at, we had every department had to have an SEND representative, and that representative had to come to the SEND meetings which we held half-termly, and they had a particular focus. They might have an ADHD focus or an ASC focus, dyslexia, whatever, and I would do a presentation. I might talk about some individual pupils, and then it would be a kind of a Q&A so that member of that department could ask questions that they were finding difficult on that aspect of learning. So, what was that department finding difficult with their ADHD kids, for example? And their duty then, and it very much was their duty was then to feed back to their department what they had gleaned within that kind of training session.
That's really good. I was going to come on to the point just about the whole process of someone identifying someone's needs who might need an assessment. We were talking off mic just before we went on air, just in terms of that conversation you might want to have with the parent to highlight that your son or daughter might need to be assessed for something like autism or
Yeah.
ADHD or dyslexia, and that and you I think you were touching on something like you would do an assessment based on their needs and try and work out what are their strengths are and what are their areas for improvements are, which then feeds into the whole. Okay, if it's an area that we feel that they're struggling in, that could be possibly as a result of an underlying diagnosis.
Exactly. So some parents kind of already have an idea, don't they? And all you really need to say to them is, actually, we think there is some ADHD going on, and we know that you've been seeing that at home because we know you've been talking to us about it. Yeah. And that's a really straightforward conversation. Or autism or dyslexia. But others, it hasn't occurred to them, or they haven't seen it, or it's a process to kind of introduce the concept and lead them kind of gently to the point where they're ready for their son or daughter to have an assessment. And so for me, I'm a qualified assessor in dyslexia and literacy and things, so I would probably start that process off if I knew a parent was perhaps going to find it hard, because they can be quite hard words to say, can't they? We'd like you to get an ADHD assessment, or we'd like you to get an ASC assessment. I might start for those parents that I might not have got to know, because the ones I know, I can get a good feel of whether they have detected these kind of difficulties before, or the ones that I have got to know and I can just tell that it's going, they need a softer approach. I will do my own assessments. And then within that, I can feed back that, they've got strengths and weaknesses. And I think, as I said earlier, I think, we've got to focus on the strengths as well as the weaknesses. So you're kind of giving a positive picture rather than quite a gloomy picture, because everyone's got strengths. Yeah. But, we've all of us have got weaknesses. But are those weaknesses affecting life and learning? And if those weaknesses are, what are the reason for them? And when I'm doing my assessments, I might then be able to feed back to parents and say, there are weaknesses, and I don't know, I can't say to you that I think those weaknesses are of a dyslexic nature. I think perhaps they might be there because of an inattentive difficulty, because your son or daughter just might be zoning out, and therefore their reading isn't fluent, or their comprehension isn't strong, or their working memory is a bit vulnerable, but that can attach to different difficulties or differences. Processing might be slow, and that can attach to different SEND profiles. And I think that you perhaps ought to consider having an ADHD screening to see whether that's a line that's worth going down, or an ASC screening to see whether you should pursue that. So it kind of does some assessing in school, so it gets the parents on board that there is something that ought to be explored. It's not a conclusive dyslexic profile, literacy difficulties profile, but there are recommendations to perhaps take it a bit further and explore a bit deeper.
At what point would you involve the educational psychologist?
So for me, because I'm a qualified assessor, I would be looking at what specialist do I then need to engage. So you're not an educational psychologist, but I would engage you if I felt that there was an ADHD difficulty going on. If you're not a qualified assessor as a SENCo, you're probably looking at engaging your EdPsych quite quickly, because your EdPsych is the one that's going to do those assessments that are going to bring those scores out and those strengths and weaknesses out. Okay. Does that make sense? So I tend not to bring in the EdPsych, because I'll do my own assessments and then I'll send them off to various specialists. So someone who can diagnose ASC. So like, I know that you can kind of do that here. ADHD, OT, I might, if I think they've got some dyspraxic or DCD difficulties, I might send them off to an OT. So I'm kind of the initial port of call, and then I'm triaging and sending them out to different specialists. But if you're not that qualified SENCo, you've probably got your EdPsych that you use who's doing that and going through a similar process.
Right. And then obviously the process, in a case where the child has been identified as having some underlying sort of SEND issues, they go through the assessment, and then the post-diagnostic side of things. 'cause usually I would obviously once concluding the diagnosis, be it autism or ADHD, make some recommendations within that. I always say to parents, the liaising with the school, just keep checking in with the school regularly.
Yeah.
And then give them obviously the information around ADHD. But certainly from a school's perspective, in terms of how does that look like, someone who's just been diagnosed. In this case, we can use the example for our ADHD. What's available for them to access, to help them to make school life a bit easier for them.
Yeah. So obviously I've had plenty of your reports through, and you give recommendations, and you have a recommendations kind of section for parents on your website and things. So if I got an ADHD report through, I'd be looking at what it says about that particular individual, and using the recommendations that you've given, and is it an inattentive profile, or is it some hyperactivity or whatever, and I'd be writing my pupil profile according to what you'd discovered. But I then have a bank of my own teaching strategies that fall under the ADHD remit. So I'd be putting together as comprehensive a profile as I can, and then updating the teachers. And it's things like preferential seating. Should we be seating that pupil at the front of the class, away from distractions of windows and doors, so that they're kind of under the teacher's nose? For some, actually, it works better at the back of the classroom, and then some teachers are more relaxed about them being able to stand up at their desk, for example, if they're at the back, and fulfill that need, because it is a kind of a positive need, isn't it? That need to kind of move a bit. Are the teachers chunking their information, reminding them that they need to kind of deliver it in chunks, backing it up where they can with written stuff or visuals, allowing things like fiddle toys, just something discreet that someone can use in class if they need to. So your reports will come with strategies, and I'll embellish it just from my knowledge of the pupil, for example. I will tend to draw it up. I'll send that out to the parents and say, these are the things that I think are going to benefit your son or daughter. These are what I think their strengths are. These are what the report has highlighted are the areas that we need to address. These are my teaching strategies. Are you happy with that? And when they say yes, I then send it out to staff, and sometimes if we need to, we will have a meeting about that particular child. But a lot of these strategies are the same strategies, because that's not the only ADHD child in the school at all. So a lot of the staff are really aware of these strategies. They just need to know which pupils they need to be using them for, and all of these strategies can work in every class, and they're not going to negatively impact anybody. So, parents of children who don't have ADHD shouldn't feel worried about having an ADHD child in the class with the teacher kind of using those strategies, because they're going to benefit everybody.
That is true, yeah. Me and Finn, we talked about this actually, that you shouldn't have to wait for diagnosis. If you identify that someone has a particular need or issue that could benefit from having a movement break or some rigid object, you can just provide that.
Yeah, absolutely.
As you say, that can benefit anyone, even those that don't have the diagnosis as such. And the other thing you mentioned to me as well earlier was about just trying to get the young person to understand their diagnosis as well. Yeah,
definitely. So I've already said for me it's a triangulated system where you've got three different parties who all have got to work together. So you've got the parents need to be buying in on it, school needs to be buying in on it, and the young person needs to buy in on it, because school can do strategies until they're blue in the face, but if the pupil doesn't understand what's for their benefit, then that becomes more of an uphill battle. But if the student understands their strengths and understands their weaknesses, then half of the battle is kind of already won, because they know who they are. And for me that really helps self-esteem. I think if you don't want your son and daughter knowing what their profile is, it might work in the short term, but for me in the long term, that probably starts to dent self-esteem, because inside they know that they're finding something difficult. Why can they not sit still and concentrate like their best buddy can? Or why is the teacher always saying to them, can you turn around, can you stop? So they need to understand what are the things that are difficult for them, and what can they do to help improve those difficulties. What are the things that they're amazing at that they can really kind of, flourish at and get real kind of reward from. So for me, it's everybody understanding all of it.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I do the same as well in my practice, whereby you involve parents, you involve the young person themselves, because with any treatment or anything support going forward, the young person has to be crucial, has to be the center in all of that. So if they don't understand why they are coming here in the first place and being offered some sort of treatment, it'd be hard for them to actually embrace and want to make those improvements.
Yeah,
and,
definitely.
So,
and someone who's got an inattentive ADHD profile, who might just be kind of quite quiet in class, but maybe zone in and out, and not really understand why they haven't understood what the instructions are, and are constantly kind of having to say to their buddy, what was that? What am I meant to be doing? Or so your hyperactive profile is going to be more obvious in class. They're probably going to have a bit more of a handle on, oh God, I'm a bit, why is the teacher always saying to me? But the inattentive pupil might not really realise that they're zoning in and out. The ASC pupil might not really realise that they've got some differences, and I think those are the ones that we've really got to catch and really let them understand who they are. Because if I just think back to my daughter, she was diagnosed in year 8 with ASC, and she was diagnosed in upper sixth. It took until upper sixth for the ADHD to come out, which is what you helped us with. But with the ASC, I do remember, we had big family conversations. Should we do it? Was it going to be detrimental? Would it damage her self-esteem? And I was kind of saying at home, I really think we need to go down this route, because I can see that there are some social difficulties that are going to harm her kind of self-esteem, and I can see that educationally we need to know. And what I wasn't prepared for when she had her assessment was for the assessor to turn around there and then and say, and your ASC. And I was like, wow, I wasn't expecting that. But actually it was the best thing in the world that could have happened, because when we left, she went, oh my God, is that what it's all about? Is that what's going on? And we didn't know. Even her kind of family didn't know that she detected the differences. We'd been worried about how she was going to take it, but she knew. And I think kids do know that they do feel slightly different to their neurotypical peers, and we've got to help them to understand that, and that it's fine and great.
Okay,
and
yeah. And the good thing is there's a lot of talk about on social media around things like autism, ADHD, and dyslexia, and which in a way is helpful to help people change their views, perceptions around these conditions.
We were talking, weren't we, about the ADHD Foundation, and I remember going on one of those conferences, and I can't remember who the speaker was, but there was some industry speaker, it might have been Virgin, I can't remember who it was, saying we positively look for ADHD profiles because those are idea generators. They're the ones that are fizzy and whizzy and come up with amazing novel ideas. And then we look for other people who can take those ideas and follow them through to the completion. And industry's all over it. And and in a sense, school is kind of catching up with that in a way. In school, everyone's all in one class. They're all expected to follow the same route, do the same things, because we've got to get them to the point of being able to do GCSEs and then A-levels or whatever they're doing at that stage. Whereas in industry, you can then really start to go off and specialise in the areas that you're great at. And so in that sense, education is kind of bringing up the rear. Industry is really kind of promoting the strengths of an ADHD profile or of an ASC profile, whereas in school we've got them all in one room, and we've got to meet all of those needs all in one room, and that's tough. But it's tough.
We particularly before they move to college or university, where they're not really
specialising
or choosing
Yeah.
what they really want to do,
Yeah.
where they have to do all these other
Everything.
subjects,
Yeah.
drama,
Yeah. Things
all
that
the
they're
other-
really not interested
that's not
in.
even
and-
relevant to what they want to do
Yeah.
in the end. So that can then affect how they perform. They're not putting the 100% into it.
And that applies to everyone, does it? All pupils. That's not just SEND pupils.
True.
It's,
Yeah.
everyone can kind of go, give me science any day of the week, but do I really have to go to my English class or vice versa?
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely. The pupils with SEND who have got real strengths in some areas but can't really kind of start honing them until they get into that more specialist area of education. That's a tough gig, isn't it?
Yeah, and I know you mentioned about your son and your daughter, who both will have ADD and ADHD, and you working in this field. Obviously, this kind of hits home as well. That's something that made you come into this field in the first place.
Yeah. So you just assessed my son quite recently, and there has been a change in. He is really open about talking about it now, and there's been a change, I think, in his attitude. So he's medicated. So for me, medication has worked for both of my children. Now I know it doesn't for everybody, but it really has worked. And he talks about how he definitely can tell if he's forgotten to take his pills. And we're still on that kind of journey of kind of getting into that real routine of taking them every day. I think we're kind of there. But I think he now knows why he might be finding things hard in class, and I think that's made a difference. But the teachers, I think, can now see the impact of his sustained attention because they can see the medications working, and he's less irritating, if I'm being completely honest. By the sounds of it, he's probably more focused, less twitchy, less likely to turn round, and so you start to kind of feel a bit more of a success story, and then that becomes self-perpetuating.
And academically, is that making a difference?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So,
but when you stop and you reflect and you think back to them growing up when they were younger and things, and because they were what we class as late diagnosed, if you think about it, because they were in their secondary school, compared to other children that you tend to find, generally speaking, they come in primary school and things. So that never occurred to you in those early years, or did you feel you overcompensated for their difficulties?
Well, so it's really interesting. So my daughter was having a DSA assessment. So she was getting assessed for university. So what provisions needed to be put in place for university. And being ASC, she said to me, would you mind, it was in lockdown, would you mind being on the Zoom call with me? And I said, no, that's absolutely fine. I wonder how many other parents have been on an 18-year-old's kind of Zoom call for DSA assessment. And the assessor said, what additional support have you had? And she said, well, nothing. I haven't had anything. I'm all right. I can manage. And the lady said to her, yeah, but I've heard mum talking, because obviously she was talking to me as well, or I was filling the gaps in if my daughter was kind of trying to process what she wanted to say. And she said to my daughter, you don't realise it, but you have had support every single day of your life because of the area that your mum works in, and that she's been able to kind of scaffold you. Yeah. That doesn't just apply to being a SENCo. As parents, we all know that again, what these strengths and weaknesses are, and we all know where to put that scaffolding in. So I think you can kind of, you can scaffold and you can support your child so that diagnosis perhaps comes later. Yeah. For me, it was a bit of a waiting game with my son, as you know. For me, I'd seen it a long time earlier, but it has to be present in two places. School hadn't seen it. And I think, so I'm writing a book at the moment, and on ADHD, and I'm co-authoring it. And I was doing some research the other day, and what I was kind of trying to put into words for that particular chapter was, I think he'd been sufficiently scaffolded by home, but also by school, because in a primary school setting, he had an amazing teacher where he was allowed to stand up whenever he wanted to. He didn't have to sit behind a desk. She said, it's fine, you can all stand at your desks if you want to, and he chose to stand all day long. Yeah. and you've got, teachers who are on it and can meet needs and things. The need didn't show itself until quite recently. And I think it didn't show itself until recently at school. We'd seen it for a long time at home because of that scaffolding. And because suddenly, you're a 13-year-old, you're a 14-year-old, you don't want the support of mum and dad anymore. You think you're independent, and you've got a kind of an independence that you want to assert at school as well. Yeah. And that's when the wheels begin to fall off the bus a bit. And that's, I think, what happened at school. They started to see it at that age because he was pushing back against the support of it that we were trying to provide in that natural kind of teenage way. But it wasn't quite successful. And so he was getting kind of, forgetting to take pencil cases to class and standard stuff.
And this... A few podcasts ago, I discussed, I can't remember which episode was in terms of the diagnostic criteria that we use to assess and the actual description of the symptoms of ADHD, what we look out for, those keywords that we hear when you send out forms to the school to fill out and things, where I think what we're describing is more kind of executive functioning deficits here, which some of the screening questionnaires that us professionals, clinicians use don't really capture a lot of that. So what you hear might not necessarily pick up or explain the needs that the young person is going through at that time. Yeah. Hence why you tend to find there might be a late diagnosis. Part of it could be the scaffolding you mentioned there. Some of it could be just because we're not seeing those key characteristics of a young person who's literally showing the kind of, I don't know, either they're daydreaming or they're constantly losing things, or they're all over the place, or they're very hyperactive, they're fidgety, which is how ADHD is kind of viewed in general by others. So you tend, particularly if you try and stereotype and you think about the daydreamers, girls in particular, where they might present in a different way to how boys would present in general.
I think it's really easy for girls to get lost in class. So, if I give the forms to my teachers, so like the Connors forms or whatever to fill in, they might come back to me and say, well, I can't honestly tick some of those boxes, but we know that we've got a fairly strong suspicion that there is an inattentive presentation going on or whatever. But, or as you say, a kind of more of a hyperactive, that's more obvious. But I think it's really easy for girls to get lost because girls tend to want to conform. And if you've got one of those kind of distractible, dreamy girls, they're not drawing attention to themselves in class. They might be kind of sitting on the second or third row. The people who are grabbing the teacher's attention are the ones who have got kind of more obvious behavioural manifestations. And so those girls might just be kind of drifting along. And actually, they might not even be kind of falling below the average, but are they doing well enough for them? Are they achieving their own potential, or are they underachieving for their potential because they're distracted and dreamy, but we haven't quite noticed it in class because they're not drawing attention to themselves? I think girls are inattentive girls are the hardest ones to pick up in a way.
What I'm seeing more, I saw one today actually, a young lad who is in low sixth. Same thing again, forms came back from school, not really sure. Some issues there, but not highlighting what we just described there, where we felt that we needed to intervene and do an assessment. But sometimes you get a gut instinct, particularly if you know, and you always want to have this benefit of the doubt that there might be something that's been missed. But the teachers were very honest and they were like, we don't really know this young person well because they're really quiet. They've just started the sixth form college. It's one of those where, parents are saying these issues have been there long-standing. But so I think if we were to be very, particularly services like the NHS, they're under a lot of pressure. They sent out these forms. The forms come back saying what I've just described there, not really showing much. These kids are being missed. The assessment, they say it's not ADHD, think about other things and stuff. So I think from a diagnostic point of view, in terms of how we screen young people and stuff, I think that's something that needs to be looked into. That's more from my end, really.
And presumably the older the child gets, the more weight you can place on their own feedback. So I'm thinking a sixth form pupil has more of an understanding potentially of themselves, but certainly probably can kind of vocalise, put it into words much more efficiently than a year 7 pupil can do.
Yeah.
And so at that point, can you then kind of take, if you're not getting great feedback from the school because they have only just joined in sixth form, can you kind of take into account the pupil voice?
Yeah. Clearly, I think they know themselves. And they know. I think, as you say, they're much more articulate. They're much more aware of. They can start to see the differences and how they stand out from their peers. They feel it becomes more of an issue to them, particularly when you get to those later stages in education where there's an emphasis around independence and the demands of academics is increasing, and that's highlighting the issues even more. As much as you can have the scaffolding from the parents and everyone else around them, but you find that the later years in sixth form, going into college, university, that highlights a lot of these issues. And, I can name lots of adults that I've seen whereby in childhood, I saw one a few days ago, again, no history of kind of traits or that stood out to the point where they had to do something in childhood right through till when they went to university, and then these issues surface. So if you had that support system around you in school, home, and if you're a female as well, sometimes they mask this
exactly,
which makes it harder to
pick it up early.
Because if you compare how they're presenting now as an adult and you compare to how they were as a child, there's a complete contrast there. They are literally now ticking all the boxes. And
and I think as well, and I don't know whether you agree, so if you think about my daughter, so we picked up the ADHD late with the ADD late with her, didn't we? So I think she was in her upper sixth. It was the April of upper sixth. And I think what had happened with her is, I think, there's a natural intelligence that carries you so far, isn't there? So if you do kind of drift in and drift out, if you've got a kind of your natural intelligence will fill in the gaps and get you so far. True. But when you hit a point where you can't do that anymore, that's where those difficulties start kind of becoming more obvious. And I think with her, do you remember she was doing A-level maths and A-level chemistry and was finding the maths in particular, but also the chemistry, more challenging out of so the biology and the geography were going fine, but those two other subjects she'd hit a level where she couldn't re-engage and quickly pick up where or fill in the gaps of where she might have drifted off. And for the first time ever, I started getting school reports about kind of mucking around in class. And I was like, what on earth is going on here? Why, you're 18. I might have expected that age 5. And I think that's the thing is, as a parent, when you start feeling that there's something different, something's changed, you need to sit up and start paying attention. And it can be 18, it can be when they've got to university or whatever, because they've developed strategies, their own strategies that have carried them through to a point. But then they can't juggle those strategies and the demand of their academics, the curriculum demands and things, and then things start to fall apart a bit.
And like I said, the independence that goes with it as well.
And those executive function skills then are not strong enough to carry you through. Definitely. It's been an absolute honour, we can keep talking about this subject all day. We've covered a lot of subjects there, and I'm trying. I made a few notes before we started, and just going through to see if there's anything that I have missed out. Exam season, that was the last thing I was going to mention. That it's obviously drawing towards the end now, and there'll be a lot of young people obviously enjoying the weather in the summer and stuff, and then lots of hopefully good news to a lot of you when the results come out, be it GCSEs or A-levels. So for those that are still doing their exams, what advice would you give? And also the ones that will be waiting for their results and considering options going forward, be it A-levels or to university, just to pick them up really and get them through the next few months. Literally for the next kind of few weeks and months?
So for the ones that are still finishing off the exams and also the ones that will be waiting for the exam results and options. Well,
so hopefully your exam concessions are already in place. So hopefully your schools are allowing you to do rest breaks or movement breaks. So the rules have changed with the JCQ now, and you have to exhaust the benefit of rest breaks before you can look at extra time. But hopefully your school, as we are mid-exam season, hopefully your school has got all that sorted, and you are getting movement breaks or you are getting rest breaks, and you've got the confidence to know that you can request them. So if you're not quite using what the school have given you, start using it. Use your extra time to proofread if you've got it. Use your rest breaks to shake yourself up, go out of the exam room, come back in, so that you've kind of stimulated that dopamine and you're ready to kind of re-engage with the exam. So if you've been given them, use them. If you haven't been given them, it's very late in the day to be talking to your school, but you do have an exams officer who can make late applications if your needs aren't being fully met, but that's going to be a really tight call, if not an impossible call. And then out of the exam room, when you're kind of getting yourself ready for your next exams, I'd be looking at making sure that you've had a decent break, you've had some decent exercise. You know, if we're looking at the ADHD, well, everybody, but particularly that kind of ADHD profile, you know, recognise your strengths and weaknesses. Can you work for 20 minutes or can you work for an hour? If you can work for 20 minutes, there is no point sitting there for an hour. You're wasting 40 minutes of your life when you could be going off, moving, doing something and then re-engaging and re-engaging for another 20 minutes. So recognise what you can do, what you can't do, and play to those strengths so that you're maximising your kind of revision time, giving yourself good opportunities for exercise, keeping a healthy diet, and then the people who are looking forward to their results, keep everything crossed, have a great summer, continue to kind of develop an awareness of who you are, check out your universities, check out your learning support departments at the universities that they can meet your needs well, because it's not just about the course, it's about the whole institution and you know, are they well set up? They've got so much better, haven't they, universities now at knowing what the needs are and how to meet them.
It's very sound advice. So yeah, lastly, you mentioned about your book. I'm quite excited, and you know, I can't wait to find out when it's out and to have. So
I'm co-authoring a book, and it's on ADHD and how we can simple strategies and techniques to kind of help ADHD profiles for parents and things like that.
Right.
So watch this space. This time next year, maybe.
Wow. Okay.
You never know.
Will I be able to get the first signed
You
copy?
will, yeah.
Amazing. I'm sure...
Yeah, I might be asking you, or we might be asking, because obviously I'm co-authoring it.
I don't want to mention that, but yeah, I think
we might be asking you to give your 2 pennies worth on...
They are. I think they'll ask me to contribute in that, so that would be really great, I think. And I think that got me thinking about, I think I can start another discussion here about just the whole writing books. And from my perspective, there's so much that I feel I've gained and, you know, observed throughout my career, and which will be and certain things that I get. Hence why we started this podcast series, just because of that. Sharing kind of good practice. It's a good, valuable resource that you can signpost parents to, or anyone really, not just our parents, or even adults, or anyone who's thinking about going down this route or finding out more about SEND or conditions such as ADHD and ASC. I'm sure we will have you as a guest at some point, hopefully just before your book launch come out. And so that's our episode 4, education. So we've done 2 parts of education today. Well, not today, but we did one with Fintan O'Regan, which again is available on Spotify. You can listen back to that. And this one will be also available on Spotify in the next coming weeks. And look forward to seeing you on the next podcast.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zoe.
Thanks so much.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.